Welcome to Pigs with Lasers podcast number 2.
Okay.
And
Welcome to Pigs with Lasers, the only podcast about pigs
With lasers.
Lasers.
Yeah. All right.
All right.
So here we are for episode 2 of our podcast. We're going to talk today. We're going to circle back and go into some of the more the developments that have occurred over the last week, some of the decisions, game decisions that are being made. I'll touch real quick on corporate stuff. Frankly, we've made no progress other than thinking about it. We're waiting for our friends at Wells Fargo to get back with us so that the account is set up so that we can fund it and begin dealing with the things that need to happen. But that doesn't mean that activities aren't going on. I know Reed is looking at getting the various domains and all the things he's going to need to get set up. So hopefully he's just chomping at the bit to get started. So
yeah,
we'll get there soon.
We just need the account open so that we can put a little bit of starting funds in the account so that we can buy domains, so that we can set up email accounts, so that we can use those email accounts to open up social media accounts without using, throwaway emails or personal emails or anything. And then once that structure is set up, we'll be ready to start posting things like this on a YouTube account or posting things to different gaming subreddits, indie gaming subreddits, once we have prototypes and stuff like that. So
cool.
That's
kind of the corporate update for now. There's not a whole lot. Again, as we kind of move forward, make sure like and subscribe down in the corner here, wherever that is.
See that.
And also, if you have any questions about any part or any aspect of what it takes to start a game design studio company, how all of the aspects from a business side, all of the aspects from the decisions that are being made by Logan now as to how the game works, what he's willing to do, able to do, why he wants to make those decisions. As you hear him talking about them, please leave your comments and questions, and we'll try to address those in future episodes. So with that, I think, Keith, you got some areas you want to touch on first, get us started?
Yeah, my background is as a fiction writer. Like all of my education and training is in fiction and reading and understanding story comprehension. And I don't really know anything about video game development or storytelling from the aspect of like game design, I guess. And when I'm telling a story, when I'm writing a piece of fiction, I can start from any point. I can choose a character or a setting or any number of other things. And I can begin my story that way, and I can build plot from those or begin with just plot itself. And I was kind of wondering what, in your experience, the driving factor is for video game design. Is it purely artistic? Is it like conceptual? Is it like market driven?
I will put a disclaimer out there that I'm not like some end all be all of game design knowledge or game development knowledge. Like, I'm definitely learning myself, and that's kind of the point of why we're doing this. But from my industry knowledge and my experience, it's kind of like a really wide net to cast, right? When you talk about why people create video games and what the motivation are behind them. There's just so many different types of games, right? It's sort of like music and movies and every other form of entertainment in that way, even literature and stuff. Why someone writes poetry might be different from why somebody writes like a mystery novella, right? Or something like that. Like, it's just very different, right? So you're going to have groups of people like us who are just like, I really want to build the game that I want to play, and I'm going to try to make it because I think it would be really fun, right? And you try to do that grassroots kind of thing. Then you've got large studios, publishers, corporations who are thinking, well, it doesn't make sense for us to develop a game just on a whim, right? So let's try to do some market research and figure out like what do we think is hot right now? What do we think is going to resonate with a certain target audience? And that's a good thought experiment to have for any game project. Even if you're starting at a grassroots like us, you should always think like, who am I making this game for? And if the answer is I'm making this game for me and my friends, that's fine. But if you plan on selling the game and making a bunch of money on it and hopefully like developing your own studio and your own practices, then maybe you should start to think a little broader than that and think, okay, the larger market is these types of people who like these types of games, who are going to connect with these types of mechanics, and starting to combine those things into hopefully a product that is marketable to a lot of different people and becomes popular.
Let me ask you a question. I don't know if you want to get into this or not, but just listening to what you're saying, especially around the studio side, do you have any anecdotes or specific scenarios that you've encountered that you want to talk about from your past as to how a big studio can kind of see something in the market but not be able to execute on it as rapidly as possibly they need to?
I feel like you're reading this up for a very specific reason.
I'm just asking whether you want to give us some stories, you know, of what you've seen.
I've seen. I won't go into too many specifics because I feel like that could be a rant. But I have told you stories where I've seen the publisher that I used to work at, Hyra Studios, the game developer and publisher. They had a lot of opportunities, a lot of cool opportunities. They've done a lot of cool stuff. And there are definitely some opportunities that, I mean, everyone makes mistakes, right? Like, it's not, I'm not saying that you have to be perfect and you have to capitalize on everything perfectly, but, you know, I think there have been several fairly public times when they had an opportunity, golden opportunity in their hands, and it slips through for one reason or the other. And, you know, that can happen to anyone, but it definitely, you know, you never know what's going to happen with game development. It's very agile. It's very tumultuous. You know.
Well, and it's driven by public perception.
And
so
it's driven by
if
public
somebody
perception.
does something to upset the apple cart, very quickly you can lose your public support, and then you're dead.
Exactly.
Right?
It's very community driven and it's internet driven, especially now that video games are distributed through the internet primarily. They're large communities of social media and different Discord and Reddit and Twitter. They'll grow around these games. People playing the games, people sharing things from the game to each other, creating fan art, creating fan content, and basically just like rallying around this thing as a hobby that everyone likes. And that's really awesome and powerful, but it can also be like, you basically have a lot to live up to as a developer, because then you've got, you know, hundreds of thousands or millions or even a couple dozen people who have played your game and are saying, oh dude, it needs to be like this. But if that doesn't match up with the way that you want it to be, then you've got to either make some compromises or say that's the way I want it to be, and if it fails, it fails.
Well, that clearly shows, though, the artistic aspect of this, whether you're writing a novel, Keith, or whether you're making a movie, or you're making a record album, right? I mean, think about how many bands, you know, that had a great first album, and then they have the quote-unquote sophomore slump, right? And the reason they have it is because they're artists, and they're trying to stretch their legs and do what they really envisioned to do, but maybe their audience was like, well, no, I really like that pocket full of kryptonite song. I don't want you to do something else, right? And so that, you know, I know you probably don't want to get into that specific example, but you'd shared with me an example of exactly, I think, the scenario where you come down, Keith, on the two sides of it. Are you doing it for the passion of doing it, and maybe you make money, or are you doing it specifically to make money? And if you're a studio, by definition, you're doing it to make money. And the problem becomes, once you put something out there, it's out there, and you don't just get to drive it. It's like when a guy develops a movie, right? When he releases it, it's done. That's what it is. And so the problem here is when you start to release and then decide you want to change things, maybe you alienate people.
I mean, I think that's why I relate it to other entertainment products a lot, is because it is kind of like that, where when you're working with a small team or a small development studio or self-funded, or, you know, you have a certain set of constraints where you're allowed to do whatever you want, right? And so you're going to create the game you want to create, and the larger you become, the more people you bring onto the team, the more investment you get, the larger these projects become, the more you can't fail, right? It's not that then games certainly do fail, but it becomes, I don't want to say it becomes more about the money, because there are certainly teams that are really large. Every single person on that team is passionate about games and creating games. But from the studio's perspective is, we've got to make this game as good as it can be to make as much money as it can be, because we're spending tens of millions of dollars on developing this title. We can't just like take a bet that like this weird experimental thing maybe is a success, right? So it definitely becomes more.
I feel like that was a jab, but whatever.
What's that?
I feel like that was a jab at me. This weird experimental thing. I wrote experimental.
No, definitely not. I mean, I just feel like that's what, you know, back to your original question, Keith, like when you're talking about developing a world and developing characters and where do you start with a video game, that's kind of ties into this of like, if it's you and me making a video game, we can start wherever the hell we want. We can write it, and I can take one of your books or one of your narratives, and we can just make a game based off of that. But I guarantee you, if you wrote a fictional narrative and took it to a studio publisher and were just like, hey, I want to make this into a video game, will you give me $50 million to do it? They'd be like, haha, no, right? You would have to have a fully fleshed out vertical slice with business research and a market plan and stuff like that to like sell somebody on the idea of like, okay, let's invest a serious amount of money behind this. There's a lot of interest in this product. Let's go with it, right? So that's just kind of the world and the scope of the industry of like working with these massive AAA teams down to a couple of dudes in their garage.
I think the point I was trying to make was to an extension of what you talked about last episode, which is there's nothing wrong with being part of a big studio, right? And there's some great studios out there, but it's you become a cog in the machine versus when you are building your own artistic vision and you have full control over it.
But I will say the benefit, and I want to make it clear, the benefit to being at a large studio is that you're going to be able to do things that no smaller studio will ever be able to do.
Oh, like
unless
the motion capture thing.
Like the motion capture thing that I was talking about. I watch Brackeys. He's a really well-known YouTuber for Unity, who actually stopped doing YouTube, I think earlier this year, which is really sad. But he for several years, he was a really amazing Unity tutorial YouTuber. And I watched one of his videos on motion capture, where a motion capture company lent him out a suit to use for one of his videos. It was like a $30,000 suit or something like that. Something that's totally unobtainable for normal small teams because you may not have that kind of funding, especially not for something like that.
Yeah.
And he was able to take the suit and basically run around with his friend and jump off some stuff and do some movements and import those animations directly into Unity on a rig. And he had an animated character running around in like an hour, right? With like really complex backflip animations and like things that might take an animator days to work out, right? A really skilled animator several days to nail. And it had really fluid and realistic movements. And I remember commenting to you like, damn, if I had one of those suits, we could just roll around outside for 20 minutes and have all the animations that we needed for our game. But that's kind of like the difference between working at one of these large studios who will either hire a motion capture company to, rent the suit for whenever you need it, or maybe they have one of these suits themselves for their animation team, and they can just crank out, if you're doing that type of game that does, normal humanoid animations, you can crank out tons of animations that way.
But I guess
What's up, Keith?
I was just going to throw it out there, man. If anybody from Unity is listening and wants to like throw us a suit so we can roll around in them.
Yeah. It wasn't Unity.
You want to roll around in it.
I forget which company, sorry, it was, but it wasn't Unity specifically. It wasn't their suit, but it was a company that made a motion capture suit, and software, I think, was the main part of the cost. Their proprietary software.
I think what I'd add, though, for our viewers is that's an example of an asset that you're not going to get access to unless you're at a big studio, or, into your point, a very popular YouTuber or whatever that gets a loaner. Unless, and this is what I want people to understand, it's come to my attention. I'm amazed at how many things are out there for rent or for lease. Like if you want to go render some kick-ass VFX, you don't have to own a kick-ass machine. There are render farms out there that you can just, all you have to have is be able to upload your raw stuff. And Jeremy does that all the time and use a render farm to get stuff to come out faster. And it's reasonably priced. So I would imagine, just like Jeremy and I, for another project, we had rented a high-end movie camera or a recording camera. And, the fact of the matter is those things are out there and you can get them. I would imagine if you looked online, whatever the name of this thing, I bet there's a place where you can rent one of these motion captures for a day or a week for some reasonable price.
No, for sure. Without going into too much detail, the animation team they hired a studio out in LA. In the studio, they basically talked to these guys and would say, hey, they'd pick out actors and they'd say, we want you guys to do these movements. People would submit like tapes of them doing movements and dances and stuff. And they'd pick the ones they want, and then those actors would go into the studio, put on the suit, and they'd rent out the studio for like a day or two. And then they'd capture like hundreds of animations, and then they'd take those back in the studios, and they'd have the animators tweak the keyframes to make it look the way that we wanted for the game, but like 90% of the movement is there, right? And in that way, they were able to generate really high quality like emotes and movements and stuff.
Go ahead.
I have a question. So like going back to this idea between like corporate and independent,
Yeah.
like obviously like you had an idea just for a game, or like, you know, we talked about like the concept or where it came from last time. But, you know, there wasn't like really anything. Like what you built from it was a game that you wanted to develop. Like personally, like I like point and click adventure games, but they're not very popular, so there aren't very many of them. So like, how did you make the decision for what type of game to start developing?
I would say, on your note of point and click adventures, I feel like there's actually like a decent amount of point and click adventure games out there. Like there's a decent.
What's the point and click adventure?
It's just fully 2D. You just, well, sometimes they're 3D, but like you point and you click at a certain thing, and the character walks over and interacts with the thing, and some text pops up, and it tells a story. It's not a very mechanics heavy. It's not very. You're not controlling the character and jumping around and doing crazy things. You're just walking around a scene and inspecting things.
So is it Zork with
yes,
graphics?
With graphics,
okay.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's like a Maniac Mansion or Monkey Island.
Mist, wasn't Mist one like that?
Mist is similar, except you did walk around in that one. You actually had a character controller, very basic. And there's more games, like I forget what, there was a spiritual successor to that one that was also very popular not too long ago. Right, I would say that there's a decent market for that if that's something you're interested in. But personally, I mean, those are fun experiences. I'll play through them, but it's not really the type of thing that I'm interested in making. And honestly, we were kind of thinking about this before anyone else was involved in the project. So this is kind of like me and Reed's little brainchild in terms of game design. But we were thinking like, what kind of game would we want to play? Specifically, I was thinking like, man, what kind of game would I want to play if I had a controller in my hand and I had a character on the screen? Like, what would I want to do with it? What would be fun to do? And we thought back to a lot of the games that we used to play on Xbox and PlayStation 2, things like Republic Commando, you know, shooter games with deathmatch, and we would just spend all day spy versus spy playing these little competitive games that are just local multiplayer fun games. And I started to think, well, what if you had a character moving, jumping around, very fluid movement, but you were also like shooting a little bit, but it's not like,
it's not the focus.
It's not the focus of the game is not to be a shooter. It's not to be a hyper competitive, like third person shooter or something. And I had this kind of concept idea in my head, and I started to write things down for it. And that's kind of before Reed brought up Team Buddies, and I wasn't sure exactly. I had kind of a loose idea in my head, but I hadn't nailed it down. And then he brought up Team Buddies, and I was like, oh. Then you layer on the crafting mechanic from Team Buddies, and then I found more references for movement and more references for shooting. And I was like, okay, it's going to move like this. It's going to shoot like this. It's going to have a core game loop of this. And then in my head, I was like, oh, that makes sense, right? All these different pieces combined into something that I can wrap my head around, and I know how to make each individual component of it in Unity, right? So that's when I really was like, oh, I could do this, right? And then we had Reed jump on with also wanting to help out with level design and general game design. Keith jump on with wanting to help out with narrative and world building and stuff like that. And Jeremy jump on with wanting to help out with 3D modeling and animation. And we've just been able to kind of piece together little pieces of this so far. And I think we have like a much more cohesive vision of what we're working on now. But in terms of design for Pigs with Lasers, it pulls from, I think, 2 major inspirations. So the first, in terms of character movement and core game functionality, is Ratchet and Clank, the whole Ratchet and Clank series. So I know you guys may not know them. Keith, do you know them?
Yeah, I know them.
Okay, so Keith knows them. Dad doesn't know anything about them. It's an old game that came out, I think, on PlayStation 2 is when they started coming out. They're pretty old at this point. I think like 2002 was like the first Ratchet and Clank game. And there have been like half a dozen Ratchet and Clank games at this point. The latest one came out. They rebooted it in 2016 with all new graphics for the PS4. They also released a movie alongside it, and there was kind of like this movie game tie-in thing, and it was really cool. It was a really fun game, and they're making another one right now. But essentially, what Ratchet and Clank is it's a action platformer, 3D action platformer that focuses on crazy weapons and guns and gadgets, right? So you've got your Super Mario 64, which is running around in the 3D space, jumping, double jumping, wall jumping, basically doing platformer stuff, right? You've got, it goes all the way to Act 2 Mario with 2D platformers running forward.
I played that.
Sure. That is called a platformer game, right? So the challenge of the game comes from jumping on different types of platforms, avoiding obstacles, jumping on enemies, that sort of thing. That is the core of a platformer game. That was later translated into 3D as a 3D platformer game with Super Mario 64, Donkey Kong 64, Banjo-Kazooie, some of these other Spyro Enter the Dragon, right? So like, or maybe not that specific Spyro, but I think it's Dragonfly. But the Spyro games and a lot of other like GameCube, PS1, PS2 style games were the first Nintendo 64, PS1. Like that's when 3D started to happen, and they started making these 3D platformers, right? So you got 3D characters running around the world, moving platforms. It's basically the same thing. You're jumping across platforms, you're solving puzzles, you're jumping on the heads of enemies. Some games started to add, maybe you shoot a little gun forward and it's a special ability or something, and they started to add little mechanics here and there. I'm thinking of Tasmanian Tiger, I think was the name of the game. You had a boomerang. And then you've got Tack, which was like a really obscure GameCube game. There's also a Tack 2. These are all games that are based around a 3D character in the world, jumping, double jumping, ground pounding, using those basic core movement mechanics of a platformer in a 3D environment. Then you had Ratchet and Clank, which came along, and it had all of those things. You could run, you could jump, you could double jump. It felt fluid, but then you've also got your gun, right? And they've got these crazy sci-fi, exactly what we're going for, sci-fi over-the-top weapons where you've got like the discombobulator or whatever. They've got like dozens of different weapons in their game, and they all do crazy things like launch grenades and turn people into sheep and do weird, wacky things. But it was still centered around this action platformer movement where you were jumping, you were double jumping.
They literally have something that turns somebody into a sheep?
Yeah. It's called the Sheepinator. It's called the Sheepinator. Cool. Right? So that weapon's called the Sheepinator. It's really interesting. So, but the idea is they combine kind of third-person shooting with this action platformer, but it has less emphasis on the third-person shooting because most third-person shooters, you've got the camera up and behind the character and slightly offset behind the shoulder. If you're talking about like Fortnite or some of these other like really like, I want to say competitive third-person shooters, and when you ADS or aim down sights on your weapon, it goes in tighter on your character, and all you really see is like the character's shoulders and head and weapon, and then you kind of shoot it wherever you're aiming. But Ratchet and Clank was centered behind the character, so it wasn't offset on the shoulder, and you just kind of shot wherever your cursor was in the center of the screen. And the weapons were so wild and so crazy that like it was less about I'm gonna frag this guy and get like a perfect headshot, and it was more like I'm gonna shoot 50 million projectiles and it's gonna hit something, and I'm gonna do a double jump backflip while I'm doing it. And it was just like really fun, cartoony mayhem, right? And so that was kind of like, if you could take that core concept and move it to a multiplayer space, because they had multiplayer modes in some of the Ratchet and Clanks, but they weren't quite there, right? Like they had, I think 2 times they attempted to make a multiplayer mode and they just did too much. They just made huge levels with way too complex mechanics. And I remember watching a video of it with Reed, and we went like 11 minutes without seeing anyone fight because they were running around to different points on the map and collecting resources and doing XYZ. And I was like, when are they going to fight? Like, and they fought for like 30 seconds and then it was over. And I was like, they just never found that. They never put players in a situation where, you know, they could really make that combat shine. So my idea was like, well, let's take that movement of Ratchet and Clank and some other action platformer games. Let's combine it with this crafting mechanic of Team Buddies, which is what I mentioned in the last podcast and what I've talked about before. Team Buddies is an old PlayStation 1 game that is kind of like a cult classic, I want to say. It's like $500 like to buy it today. It's like insanely expensive. So if you want to play it, you probably have to download a ROM of it. But it's this game where it's more of a top-down view, and you run around as these little pill body characters, and you pick up boxes in the center of the map. You just go, you pick up a box, you take it back to your base, and you've got a 2x2 crafting square. You got a 2x2 kind of pad. And you place the boxes on this pad, and they link up in different ways. And depending on which ways you place the boxes, whether it's 2 horizontal, 2 vertical, 2 horizontal, 2 vertical, 4, you know, and depending on what layout you lay them in and then destroy the boxes, different things will drop out of the box. So you can make reinforcements. You can make more little pill body characters that will follow you around and shoot people and pick up weapons. You can make light weapons. You can make heavy weapons. You can make a tank if you put 8 and make a full box, right? So they've got all these different creative things, and it's like, but it really drives the gameplay of, well, I got to go collect these boxes. I got to build something. I don't know what, well, in Team Buddies, you know exactly what you're going to get out of the box. You're like, I'm going to build an RPG. All right, I got an RPG. Now I'm going to run around. You know, it was just like a little fun game, and you shot at each other, and whoever was the last one standing won. Or there was like a dozen different game modes in Team Buddy, actually. But the idea is take that crafting mechanic of collecting boxes, taking them back to your base, using them to build at least an idea of what weapon, like a light weapon or a heavy weapon, combining that with the movement and the camera controls of something like an action platformer, like that I'm like, oh, I can see how you can build a game mode around that. Like you can build a game loop around that. Like I want to go collect this box to build a weapon to kill Reed, right? And we're playing against each other. I'm like, that's a game that we would have played, you know, 15 years ago in our basement, you know, as kids. And I'm like, that sounds fun. So that's kind of like where it came from for us. And of course, as we're thinking about all this, we've already layered on the pigs with lasers thing, right? So that was kind of the writing prompt challenge from you that started this whole thing of like, well, if you were going to make pigs with lasers, what would it be, right? So now we've got this game design, which is based off of several other references and pulling mechanics from several places. We've got what we feel is like a really strong hook in terms of aesthetic and narrative, like you said, Keith. Maybe it doesn't have too much narrative from the outset, but it's got a lot of personality because of that phrase.
Pigs with lasers, man. That's really all you need.
Exactly. It's kind of all you need. And you combine those two things, hopefully in a smart and interesting way that makes it appealing to people. So when they pick it up, they're like, oh, this game's really fun, and it's goofy, and it's cartoony. Yeah, this has potential. That's kind of what you want to combine into.
You know, in the past week, you've shared with me some of your decisions, design decisions, game decisions that you're making. And what I'd like to do is share with our audience how you know when you have to make these decisions, what goes into them, and like all of the rationale that you've used to come to decisions that you're making. And the first one, obviously, is that you've shown me a little character animation that you're doing of a pig, and that led me to, I didn't really understand, right? And so when I saw that pig initially, I was like, so this is what, like a rough asset that you're going to use just to build your character controller? And you're like, no, this is actually the foundation of how we do this. And so talk about why a pill body and how you want to manipulate it and all of those things.
So I'll say, in terms of development, the character controller and the camera controller are the core of the gameplay. They aren't, I haven't developed them yet. I'm working on them. I've got a good place to start. I just got a lot going on. So like, that's my focus, is trying to get the character controller and the camera controller figured out, and then get a character, a model, an animated model, working with that setup so that it looks and it feels good. Even if it doesn't have all the mechanics, even if we don't have box crafting, we don't have shooting, we don't have all this stuff. If I can get a character in the game moving around, jumping on stuff, you know, back flipping, side flipping, doing all the things that I know we're going to want the character to be able to do, and that core set of movement feels good, then it's like, okay, this is a solid base to build off of. And then you can build each feature on top of that and make sure that each feature itself feels good. And then hopefully by the end of it, you've built the entire gameplay loop, and each individual component of it feels solid and like it all fits together. So kind of what we were doing there is while I was working on the programming side of it, Reed and Jeremy kind of are working on more artistic side of it. They're starting to learn more about Blender and how to import and export from Unity. And they're starting to experiment with just modeling and VFX and stuff like that. So we did a little bit of research into what would we want the art style for the game to be, what would we want it to look like, what's feasible. And my first thought, coming from like a studio background, was, well, let's hire a concept artist, and then let's Let's have a modeler make that character that the guy concepts, and then let's have someone rig that model, and then let's have someone animate it, right? That's your standard pipeline.
And that's when we first talked, that's what I thought
Yes.
I thought we would be creating all of these different character designs, but I think it changed.
Yeah. So that is your typical studio, and that's kind of the difference between a studio, like an established studio and a new studio, is an established studio with a lot of experienced people would be able to go through the process of, I'm going to concept this character, I'm going to 3D model them, I'm going to rig them, and then I'm going to animate them, and I'm going to get them in the game. If you don't have people who are experienced with all those different things, you're going to have to pay people for each of those different things, right? So I reached out to a concept artist. I was like, hey man, I really like your work. Like, how much would it cost for us to commission a character from you? And he gave me a reasonable estimate, but we kind of took that estimate and talked about it and thought, we don't have a lot of starting capital. We don't have a ton to work with. Is this the most efficient way we can use that to go the furthest, with what we've got? And the answer was like, no. I mean, yeah, we'd probably get a really cool character out of it by the end, and it would look really good, but it would be really expensive, and we're going to need more, right? One character isn't the only thing we have in the game. So we kind of thought, like, all right, let's go back to the drawing board. Like, what can we do? Like, what's more feasible through either our own skills or, the amount of money that we have to work with. And we found we knew this already, but there are a lot of 3D model asset stores online. So there's Unity Asset Store, Unreal Asset Store, there's Sketchfab, Turbo Squid. There's just probably half a dozen different stores where you can go online and just buy the rights to use 3D models from people. Artists can just make stuff. They can make just models. They can rig their models. They can rig and animate their models and just sell these things on these platforms. We'd already taken a good look through these things and pulled out some possibilities. And one of the possibilities we took another look at was this pig with a pill-shaped body. And I remember looking at it the first time and just thinking, well, it's close, but there's just something missing with it. And I think we kind of moved on from it. But then we came back to it, we took another look at it, and we were like, wait a second. If we add a mouth to that thing, if we take that model, we get that model for like $20, I think it was, and then it's already rigged, right? It's fully modeled, already rigged. If we like added to it a little bit, maybe add like a little mouth that, can be animated, that would actually fit really well. And maybe in the engine, we end up putting a toon shader or something on it and really spicing up the visuals of the textures in the engine in post. Like, that could actually stand out and be something really interesting and unique if we tweak it in these specific ways.
How does that licensing work, though?
I have no fucking clue.
well, as a business guy,
I have a clue, but I'm not 100% certain.
Okay.
I'll say you buy the right to use these things. Read through some terms and indicated that if we wanted to use it in a commercial product, we would need to pay a different licensing fee, but it wasn't much more than what we had already paid.
Okay, right. So it's like a general purpose use license, a GPU license to some degree. I think the question that in my mind I'm asking is, I've seen that pig model. Mm-hmm. You've explained to me how you're going to modify that pig model and what it's going to look like, substantially different than the way it's the model that you bought or licensed.
Sure.
For me, the question becomes, okay, again, as a business guy, I look forward to say, this is going to be successful. Yeah. Your job is to create it and to keep your mind positioned that it might not get any traction at all. My position is, okay, this is going to be successful. And as a result of it being successful, we need to have thought through some things like, let's say it's Angry Birds. How do you think that would work if the guy that came up with Angry Birds picked up some model and was like, hey, this is a cool model for a bird.
Right.
And he puts it in there and it wildly successful. And then he goes, hey, I'm going to merchandise my Angry Birds. And they go, sorry.
I will say,
you don't have merchandising.
So I'm like 99% certain that there aren't any licensing concerns with these assets because they're on stores specifically for that and you buy them.
Yeah.
I will say there's another good example of an indie game recently called The First Tree. Mm-hmm. I haven't played it, but I've seen a lot about it, and I've listened to GDC talks from the developer. This is an artist who made this game on his own in nights and on nights and weekends while supporting his family. And it's just a really inspirational story of like, how the hell did this guy make this incredibly successful game on his own? And he went through his process, and what he ended up doing is kind of exactly what we're doing, where he bought a fox. The main character is a fox. He just, and really all you do is walk around an environment and solve puzzles and explore and stuff like that. And it's a really cool game, but he bought this fox, imported it into his project, and then used his artistic skills to modify that fox just enough. Like he used some shaders to make it look different. I think he maybe did some texture work on it. But at its core, like the rig and the animations of that fox are the same as what he bought, right? Like all the parts that he didn't, I don't know if he knew how to change them or not, but like he didn't want to change. He just basically used the rig and animation, and just, I don't think he even made geometry changes to the fox, but he ended up making it unique enough that if you see that fox right next to the original asset, you'd be like, no, those two things aren't the same thing, but they're in the same pose. And you'd be like, oh, those are probably using the same rig. So kind of what we're looking at is taking this pig character that's already rigged. It's not animated yet, but it is rigged, and basically saying, okay, sure, this isn't our custom character. Like we didn't make it. Mm-hmm. How can we make it stand out? How can we take this thing and use the skill set that we have and make it stand out? So the answer to that is, sorry, Keith, you got something?
Well, yeah, I guess so. Like at what point is the asset, does the asset ever become yours? Like right now you're like leasing the asset, and I assume somebody else could come along and use the exact same asset.
Absolutely. So that's kind of like, yeah, that's the downside of like using publicly sold assets, is that anyone could come along and use it. So you really have to make sure that you take something and make it unique enough through whatever you're capable of doing, so that it doesn't, if someone comes along and makes the same game or makes a different game with the same asset, you don't then have a problem with like, oh, well, my character looks exactly like that.
And so from a business perspective, even though there's a very clear parallel to what I do in enterprise software, mm-hmm. in that there are pieces of technology out there that we license.
Yeah.
Because it's like, why reinvent the wheel? Somebody already solved that problem.
Yeah.
So we're building this thing, and we want to use this piece that somebody's already done. We license that piece, and we pay some kind of fee for how we're going to use it. And typically it's just some relatively small fee, not like $20, but it's a relatively small fee. And we now have license to use that within our product. And there might end up being 200 different software on the products in the market that are using that same piece.
Yeah.
But everything around it looks different. You wouldn't even know they're using the same piece underlying. And that's kind of similar here. You're saying, this is just a piece of clay. I'm just starting from this, and I'm buying a clay because it's already rigged in a certain shape, but now I'm going to carve it, and I'm going to make it mine. I'm going to paint it, and I'm going to make it totally unique to me.
So the idea here is that we can take this model that's a very simple model, very simple shapes, very simple setup, modify. One of us can probably figure out the skills to modify the textures to make other characters, right? So like we had talked about in other conversations, we had talked about having a robo-pig, right? As one of the things that you can create out of the boxes in the game to assist you is having little robo-pigs that follow you around. Well, really all we would need to do is take this pig asset, change the color of the surfaces. So right now it's like a little pink pig, just change it to silver or gray, draw on the texture, figure out a way to draw on the texture, draw plate lines and then rivets, and then make the eyes green. And suddenly you've got like the same pig, but now he's a robo pig, right? Well, because you've changed his texture. And texture changes are pretty simple to make. You can obviously get really in depth with texture work, but what I'm saying is we don't need to do that to hit this style.
Would you change his animation so that he was more robot-y?
But we could, right? So we could, right? That's the thing, but we don't have to. That's like a detail. Right. So the idea is that this character runs a humanoid rig, which means he just has the bones that run all throughout his body that let him bend certain parts of his body to do certain things, which lets animators then take each part of his body and pose them into keyframes, and then a collection of keyframes is an animation, right? So the idea is that we can take this fully rigged character, figure out a source for animations, whether that's us making the animations ourselves or finding open source animations online or working with another developer who's willing to help us out with animation, and getting a basic walk cycle, a basic run cycle, a basic jump, eventually a double jump, a flip, a side jump, a flip. And once we get all the basic movement animations in there, looking good, feeling good, that's where we're at. That's the point that I was talking about earlier. Then we're at a point where we have a character in a scene, even if it's just a flat plane with cubes, right? But he's able to run around it. He's able to jump up on things, jump around, double jump, and it feels good. We have the physics of it feeling good. We have the movement feeling good. We have just the general feel of the game character controller feeling good and looking good because you've got a character in there. It's got hopefully your own little art style flair. It's got maybe some post-processing shader effects on it. And then it's got, these animations that hopefully are looking pretty smooth and blending pretty well together. And at that point, it's like, okay, look at this cool thing. And you put that on the internet and people are going to go, oh, look at that. That's a pretty slick looking project. Mm-hmm. What is it, right? And at that point, you can start adding mechanics week to week to week, and suddenly that's when you've got more interesting things to show, and you've got things happening.
Well, in the podcast, as you move forward these things, right now we're talking to a lot of them because you're trying to write the character controller and stuff, but very shortly these will move more from open discussion to more focused on things that are accomplished. By the time we actually have viewers and subscribers, it'll be too late, most likely.
Right.
But I just want to point out, if anybody is seeing this podcast, and I know that I just saw Reed was in the process of getting the Lizardsniffer Studios YouTube channel up where these will be hosted at. Yeah. But as soon as people are able to see these, and if you're watching and you go, hey, I'm a freaking animator and I can animate shit, and that'd be, this sounds like you guys are kind of cool and I'd like to work with you.
Yeah, come join
us. Reach out, because if they haven't, if his team hasn't yet conquered a certain thing, you never know when there might be somebody out there that does shit.
For sure.
Pigs with freaking lasers, absolutely.
For sure. But I think there's a lot of, I wanted to touch on some of the other reasons we went with this character. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to doing it the way we're doing it. At least we're hoping there are going to be a lot of benefits of it. We don't know for sure yet. But the character is very simple. It's a pill-shaped character, and just so people have a good idea of kind of what we're
the very first starting point of where you're at.
Basically what we bought off the internet. So it's this pig character that's a very simple shape, meaning that if Jeremy or Reed wanted to recreate it, modify it, do anything to it, it's not super complex in terms of 3D modeling. So like they could definitely like figure that out and learn to do that. It's also set up in a way that we could remove the ears, because right now it's got 2 ears up here. We can remove the ears, change the textures, and suddenly you've got a different type of character, right? We can take that and we can have Jeremy or Reed model a cowboy hat instead of ears, and suddenly you've got a farmer, right? And then you texture a plaid shirt and overalls, and then you've got a farmer, right? The current plan is to add a mouth onto the character, like a Wallace and Gromit style mouth. Jeremy actually, I think, threw a mock-up of that. I'm not sure if he threw it in the Discord or if he threw it to me personally, but him and Reed have been working on that, and it looks awesome. Like that's the thing that was missing. When we first saw the character, we were like, this is really good, but something's missing. We came back to it and we were like, it needs a mouth. It needs a Wallace and Gromit style claymation mouth that animates with whatever you're doing and makes silly, funny expressions. That's going to really take this character to the next level. So adding that, being able to modify the attachments and whatever else is on it to make new characters means that we don't have to change the rig. We don't have to change the set of animations. All we have to do is take this model, retexture it, and it'll work the same way as a pig, right? So we take the farmer and he can run the same running animation as the pig because it's got the same rig. The problem with, like you mentioned, Keith, doing a lot of custom characters is like, that's only feasible when you have a motion capture suit or a full team of animators in a full pipeline stack where you're able to go, all right, concept me out these 10 characters who are going to be in the game, all right, model all these characters with specific models. One character might be really big and muscular. One character might be a child, right? And you've got a lot of variation in the model. Then every single one of those characters is going to need to be basically customly rigged, right? Or have a custom rig or a variation of the rig male to female walk differently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to need to have a male rig and a female rig. Like that's about as basic as you can get it. But then you're probably also going to need like a big male rig and a small male rig and like all these different variations, which really blows up your scope because then you really need someone who knows how to rig and animate. And you really need animations that are going to make sense for that character. So then at that point, you're adding scope and complexity in the whole pipeline just to create, five characters, right? And it's like, we've only got so many resources. Does it make sense is it super important for all of these characters to be totally super unique and have their own custom setups? So when we saw this pill character, we were like, why not make every single character a pill character with like a goofy mouth, and we can change the different mouth. Like the farmer can have 3 teeth and the alien can, have fangs or whatever creative shit that we want to put in it. But they all fit this custom rig, this custom style. It's easier workload for us. It's more sustainable for our team. And then also it's an homage back to Team Buddies, which also used pill style characters. That's kind of what sealed it for us, is like we saw this character and we were like, ooh, we see how we can work with this thing. And then we kind of took a look back and we were like, dude, Team Buddies, this looks exactly like Team Buddies. Not exactly like Team Buddies, but it looks like an evolution of Team Buddies, right? Because Team Buddies was little pill dudes with little arms, and it was just goofy little cartoon fun. And then, there have also been other games recently, most notably Fall Guys, that have gone viral with these pill body style characters. So it's like you've got something that's already popular in the public eye, something that people are familiar with and they can wrap their head around from the moment they see it. You've got an homage back to the original source material that we're pulling some of the mechanics from. Mm-hmm. And then it also, on the third hand, makes sense for us to work with assets that are set up like this. Cool. So yeah, that was kind of just like why we ended up going with that character as a basis and kind of what we plan on doing with it, and why we think it's a good fit in terms of art style. Mm-hmm.
What I like hearing as the business guy is, and what I hope our viewers hear is, there's so many ways, as you talked about in the first episode, to be cautious, to not break the bank. And so some of your design decisions, you can actually justify them into being a great decision for what you want to do while reducing scope, reducing complexity, and ultimately reducing overall cost going forward, which is awesome. And it makes me actually, once you showed kind of the pill thing to me and kind of talked to me a little bit more about it, I also thought about just like, you see it now. I'm sure there's got to be a Minions game, right? There's got to be the Lego game. Those things are similar, right? And they're kind of like 2D-ish, not 2D, 3D-ish.
Yeah.
What's the word low poly? I don't know what word you're using, but they're just very simplistic, cylinder-ish, pillish.
You mean the Lego games?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say those Lego characters are actually probably higher poly than they first appear. Just they're very high quality models, but they do run the same rig, right? Like you're saying, because they're all the same body, right? It's just different textures. Sometimes there's more complex Lego characters, and that's a different story. But it's also the Lego games, and they make insane amounts of money, and they're very popular. So like they have the money to be able to do custom characters. But even in studios I've worked at in the past, the concern is always like, can we be more efficient with this? Like, how many rigs do we really need? And if you're working on a huge open world RPG style game, you might need a lot of different rigs because you're going to need a lot of different creatures, a lot of different characters, a lot of different monsters to make that environment feel realistic. If everyone's moving the same way in that environment, it's quickly going to start to show, if a zombie is moving the same way as a woman in the town. Right. But if we're trying to build a game with a very concise and constrained scope like we are, or at least I'm trying to make it that way at the beginning, because I know if we build too much scope, we won't be able to execute on it. It just makes sense to get as much mileage out of a single rig as possible, because none of us are animators, none of us are riggers, right? So we can learn those skills, right? I'm excited to start learning more about that pipeline and being able to do more of that, but it doesn't make sense for us to plan and design a game that has like 10 different character types in it when we can't make rigs. So like it makes a lot more sense for us to take one rig that someone's already created that we know works, modify it maybe in little ways so that we can learn how to work with it, but use that as a basis for everything and build a world in a game around the idea that most of these characters are going to be running the same rig and using mostly the same animation set. Now there could be tweaks once we get down to, you know, prototype V2 or V3 and we're making specific art tweaks and maybe we have a better handle on how some of these things work. We can then go look at the RoboPig and say, oh, let's make a custom walking animation for the RoboPig that's a little more, you know, janky and robotic. And that's the kind of detail that even though we are creating a custom animation for that thing, we're not recreating the character design or the rig or anything. We're just doing different keyframes that hopefully give it a little more personality.
Did we already talk about the animation that was on Discord?
Yeah, I can talk about that next. Jeremy was able to post in the Discord, our private development Discord, earlier this week. He posted just a preview of the pig character crouch walking. He basically pulled a crouch walk animation off of a website called Mixamo and applied it to the rig that the character is running and played the animation in a little scene in Blender. And I think he just rendered out that little scene just to give us an idea of like, all right, what does this character look like when it's running an animation and moving? It looked awesome, right? So like
Sneaker's gonna sneak,
right? Sneaky gonna sneak. We're not gonna have crouch walking in our game, but it was cool to just look at it moving like an actual character. So kind of my first thought was like, all right, well, that's exciting. We just need to figure out a run, a walk, and a jump. Once we get those three things in there, then we can add another one, then we can add another one, and we can make sure all these things are looking and feeling good. I will say that Jeremy was looking at Mixamo, and I'm all for using Mixamo if we can. Mixamo is basically a free website. It's a website where people can post 3D models, and all of the 3D models run the same rig, the same humanoid rig, which is the setup of bones and joints on the character. And then it's also a separate search base for animations. It's basically open source. They say, come use these in your game. There's probably hundreds of different animations and characters that you can choose from. Basically choose character, choose an animation, and then it shows you on the website that character using that animation. You hit download. You can say, I want to download the 3D model with these animations. And then you can download that as an FBX file that you can then import into your project. And then you have a character running around with that animation, right?
Yeah.
So his idea was, I'm going to go take a walk and a run and a jump from there. I mean, I'm all for doing that as like an exploratory prototype type of thing, but I will say that I already did that earlier on in our first proof of concept version of the project. I went on a whole kind of exploratory binge on how we were going to get a character and how we were going to animate it and get it into Unity working with what I was trying to develop. And I was able to get a character running around, jumping and shooting, but it was kind of like stiff animations and didn't have a lot of personality to it. And it definitely looked like it was built for more of like a
shooter.
Like a more realistic style shooter. So my thought was like, that's a good place to start, but we should try, I think, to either edit those keyframes to be a little more cartoony and definitely fit some of the specific mechanics that we're going to have, like backflipping, double jumping, side jumping. That's not going to be on Mixamo. Some of the ways that we're going to want the character to hold the gun and shoot are not going to be on Mixamo, right? So we're going to need some
hooks are really going to screw with that.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, definitely. But so yeah, that's kind of like where my head is at with the animations. Is we're probably going to have to edit some of those things ourselves to add enough personality and get the stuff that we really want out of it. But I mean, that's fine. I'm interested in learning animation. It's weird. I never thought of myself as an artistic person. I tried to be artistic for a little bit in college because I was like, I knew back then when I was studying game design, I was like, art is the thing that's holding me back. I can't do game art because I'm not artistic. I can't draw. I can't sketch. But I can make a game. I just can't make the art. But when you have that disconnect, then you can't make a game by yourself because you don't know how to do the art. So you have to link up with someone. And I didn't like the idea of that. So I was like, I'm just going to learn how to do the art myself. I tried that. I failed at it miserably. I'm just not an artist. And since then, my brain has just like shut down any idea of working with like an art pipeline. Like I'm bad at 3D modeling. I'm bad at, so because I'm bad at drawing and I'm bad at 3D modeling, I'm bad at pixel art and all this different stuff. I was like, anything that has to do with the art side of the pipeline, I'm just going to find someone else to help me with. As I've started to research some of these things and learn more about the ins and outs of game development, I've realized, oh, there's this whole area of animation and rigging, which is really more technical because it's all done in software. Like you take a 3D model that someone else sculpted and textured and created, and then you add bones and joints to it, and you edit the properties of those bones and joints and skin weights and how things are supposed to react to physics and stuff like that. That's a lot of math, and that's a lot of just knowing how the software works to be able to efficiently set up rigs like that. And then that's also a lot of taking that rig and posing it in different, like that's just dragging something in an editor and capturing a keyframe and doing that 40 times to make a smooth animation. Now, obviously, skilled animators are like very artistic and creative, and they know how to make a specific movement flow well and get the right type of kind of sense of movement out of it. And that's where it becomes more of a creative aspect, but it's not like a drawing or like a hard art skill. So now I've become more interested in like, oh, I bet I could learn to do that. Like I may not be good at drawing, but I could probably learn to like set up some cool keyframes and like, well, figure out a way to interpolate between them and make good animations. Like that seems like something, because I'm good with software, that seems like something I could do.
So it's really the difference between character design, which is the artist part of, Keith saying, here's the story of this character and how this character works. And then it's an artist, a real artist, rendering it and saying, here's, comic book artist, here's your character.
Sure.
After that, it becomes much more technical and software driven to simply make that 2D art into a 3D character.
I guess the world of the tech side of it extended just a little bit further than I realized. It extended to include rigging and animation. I realized that I can probably do that. If somebody gets me a 3D model, I want to be the guy that if somebody gets me a 3D model, I can take that 3D model and get it into a game moving and working and looking and cool. So I'm excited to start figuring out animation and rigging. But I know Jeremy and Reed are also looking into that too. They've also got a big interest in that. So I'm letting them take a stab at that and just seeing what they're able to learn and what they're interested in. And then, because I've still got to focus on the character controller and basically just making sure all of this works with just a little capsule in the engine and the camera. And once all that works, then we can say, all right, guys, like, do we have like a walk, run, jump cycle? If not, what's our plan to get that done? And then we can figure out how we're gonna get that done. And then, I think once we have a character in there with basic movements looking good, then it's like, all right, time to jumpstart this. We know how we're going to get from point A to point B on some of the core things in the game. So like, let's start adding features week to week. And that's, I think, when we can come onto these and hopefully have footage and screenshots and more references and things to talk about later on. But yeah.
Cool. And hopefully, the objective would be each one of those each week to, again, just like we did here, talk about the decisions you made, why you made them, but have more visual content to be able to show.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. That way they don't have to look at all our ugly faces.
I mean, speak for yourself.
Hey, man.
All right. Keith, you got any other questions you want to bat around today, or where we at?
No, I think we've hit most of all of the basic questions. I mean, obviously I could ask like 1,000 more questions about basic design that would probably maybe bore some people, but no, that's all I got for now. I can come up with more stuff. We got like 100.
What is that behind you on your background?
Oh, what's my background here? That's the original TARDIS core here for time travel.
Oh, okay, got it.
That's a good reference for what we're going for. Oh yeah.
Yeah, I watch sci-fi, so that's my basis for creation of a lot of the models. I mean, not that I do the 3D modeling, but
well,
the idea is to
Logan has a table that's made out of the original metal rig skeleton of the transporter from the Star Trek transporter room. So I just happened to have met a lady whose husband was the prop master for all the Star Trek stuff, and he passed away. And my wife and I helped her out with some stuff, and she gave us some old things. And one of the things was this crappy looking metal frame. And I'm like, what is this? Like, why would I want this? And she's like, oh, that's the original frame that my husband built for the Star Trek transporter room console. And he ended up building it as a reusable thing that they would, create all the artistic part on top of it, and they'd put it on top of this rig, right? So for different versions of Star Trek and different shows and stuff. So it's really very similar to what you're talking about here. It's a rig, and it got used for a lot of different things, and you now have that as a table.
It's my desk now.
It's your desk.
It's my desk. Yeah, so that's cool. I think next week, I probably won't have the character controller done next week, but I hope to have a more complete design document done. So maybe next week we can run through kind of an early version of the design document and have some visual references of this is what I mean when I talk about this mechanic and that mechanic, and what will be the general.
And we could talk about what a design document is, because some of us have no idea.
Yeah, I mean, a design document is just like a Bible of like, this is how the game's going to work. This is everything that's going to be in it. Kind of, these are how all the things are going to interact. I'm not going to follow any specific format. I'm just going to find one and brainstorm on it. So,
all right, cool. Well, again, hit the like and subscribe button if you enjoyed this, and please share. We'd love to get some followers and some folks watching, because I do think that over the next 3, 4, 5 weeks, this is going to get kind of really interesting with a lot of good content for those people that are trying to develop indie games.
What's that? Yeah, it's interesting now. Exactly.
All right. Cool. Over and out. Pigs with lasers.
Pigs with lasers.
Losers.